Every war America enters comes with a promise: liberation, democracy, stability. Iraq was going to be quick. Afghanistan was going to be decisive. Both became generational disasters that drained trillions, buried thousands, and left the region more fractured than before. And now the drums are beating again, this time toward Iran. But here's what the history books, the think tanks, and the cable news panels won't tell you straight. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is a nation of 90 million people with a disciplined military, a deeply entrenched state apparatus, regional proxy networks stretching from Yemen to Lebanon, and a population that, whatever its grievances with its own government, has watched what American intervention does to a country. The question isn't whether America has the firepower, it does. The question is whether firepower wins wars anymore. And the last 2 decades gave us a brutal, expensive, and humiliating answer to that. Let's go back to 2003. The United States rolled into Iraq with what the Pentagon called shock and awe, and it was shocking. The military phase took about 3 weeks. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. The statues came down. The mission was declared accomplished. And then reality arrived. Because what the architects of that war did not understand, or chose not to understand, was that you can destroy a government in 3 weeks and spend the next 20 years fighting the society that government had been holding together. Iraq didn't end. It mutated. The insurgency grew. Sectarian violence exploded. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged where it hadn't existed before. And the United States found itself pouring money, soldiers, and political capital into a conflict that had no clean exit because it never had a clean purpose to begin with. By the time American troops formally withdrew, over 4,400 American soldiers were dead. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had been killed, and the country that was supposed to become a beacon of democratic transformation in the Middle East had become instead a fractured, Iranian-influenced state, the very outcome the war was supposedly designed to prevent. Then came Afghanistan, and here the story is even more instructive, because Afghanistan wasn't a war of choice in the same way Iraq was. September 11th happened, the Taliban were harboring Al-Qaeda, and the American response was, in many ways, initially understandable. The Taliban government fell within weeks, but then the mission expanded, nation building began, and America found itself in the same trap it had walked into in Vietnam 3 decades earlier, fighting not just an army, but a movement, not just a military force, but a cultural and political resistance that had been forged over centuries of fighting outside powers. The Soviets had tried it. The British had tried it before them. Every empire that touched Afghanistan left broken. The United States stayed for 20 years, spent over $2 trillion, trained an Afghan army of hundreds of thousands, built institutions, schools, infrastructure. And in August 2021, the Taliban walked back into Kabul in days. The government collapsed almost before the last American transport plane had left the ground. 20 years, $2 trillion. And the outcome was essentially identical to what it would have been if the invasion had never happened, except now there were more grievances, more radicalization, and a profound demonstration to the entire world that American military power has a ceiling. Now, why does all of this matter when we talk about Iran? It matters because there is a pattern here that is not accidental. It is structural. It is rooted in something that the American political and military establishment has never honestly confronted, which is the difference between the capacity to destroy and the capacity to win. These are not the same thing. The United States military is, by any conventional measure, the most powerful fighting force ever assembled in human history. Its budget exceeds the next 10 countries combined. Its technological capabilities are extraordinary. Its air power, its naval power, its logistical reach, all of it is without peer. And yet, since the end of World War II, the United States has not won a major land war. Korea ended in a stalemate. Vietnam ended in defeat. Iraq ended in strategic failure. Afghanistan ended in collapse. And the common thread running through all of these isn't incompetence, though incompetence played a role. The common thread is that military superiority does not translate into political victory when the enemy is fighting on its own soil for its own survival. Iran understands this. In fact, Iran has been studying this for decades. The Iranian military and political leadership watched what happened in Iraq. They watched what happened in Afghanistan, and they drew very specific, very calculated conclusions about how to make themselves militarily unwinnable. Not unbeatable in a conventional sense, Iran knows it cannot match the United States in a direct conventional confrontation, but winning and losing a war are not always determined by who wins the battles. They are determined by who can sustain the cost, who has the political will to keep going, and who ultimately controls the territory when the shooting stops. And on all three of those measures, Iran has built a formidable position. Start with geography. Iran is roughly 3 times the size of Iraq. Its terrain is extraordinarily diverse and difficult. Mountain ranges, deserts, urban centers, coastal areas along the Persian Gulf. Any ground invasion of Iran would require a force and a logistical operation that would dwarf what was deployed in Iraq. Military planners who have looked at this seriously, not the ideologues but the actual strategists, have described it as potentially the most complex ground operation the United States would ever have attempted. And that's before you factor in the resistance. The Iranian population is not the same as the Iraqi population in 2003. Iraq in 2003 was a country that had been bled by sanctions for over a decade, that had a Shia majority deeply hostile to the Sunni-dominated Ba'athist government, that had regional Kurdish populations with their own separatist ambitions. Iran has those internal tensions too. No country doesn't. But it also has a degree of nationalist cohesion that gets consistently underestimated in Washington. Whatever Iranians think of the Islamic Republic, and many of them have profound disagreements with their own government, history shows that populations tend to rally around their government when a foreign power invades. It happened in Russia when Napoleon invaded. It happened in Vietnam. It would happen in Iran. The very act of American military aggression would produce the political unity that the Islamic Republic has struggled to maintain on its own. Then there is the question of Iran's military doctrine, which is not a conventional military doctrine. Iran has spent 40 years building what military analysts call an asymmetric warfare capability. It is designed specifically to counter American conventional superiority. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a conventional army. It is a parallel military structure with deep ties to militia networks across the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in Yemen through the Houthis, in Gaza through various factions. This is not an accident. Iran deliberately built this network as a deterrence and a retaliatory capacity. If the United States strikes Iran, the response would not be a conventional counterattack that America could easily handle. The response would cascade across the entire region simultaneously. American bases in Iraq would come under attack. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil passes, would be threatened. Israel would face missile and drone attacks from multiple directions. Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has more rockets than most nation states, would unleash a war on Israel's northern border. The entire Middle East would be set on fire, and the United States would find itself managing not one war, but a regional conflagration with no clear boundaries and no clear way to end it. And here is where the economic dimension becomes absolutely critical, because this is what Richard Wolff would want you to understand. War is not just a military event. War is an economic event. War is a class event. War redistributes resources. And the question of who pays for war and who profits from it is never asked honestly in mainstream American political discourse. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan together cost the United States somewhere between $4 and $8 trillion. when you include long-term costs like veterans care, interest on war debt, and ongoing regional operations. That is not a rounding error. That is a generation of wealth transferred from American working people through taxes, through cuts to social programs, through inflation, through debt, into the accounts of defense contractors, private military companies, oil interests, and financial institutions. Lockheed Martin's stock price quintupled in the decade after September 11th. Halliburton made billions on no-bid contracts in Iraq. The people who designed those wars, who advocated for them, who appeared on television telling the American public that they would be quick and cheap and transformative, those people were not paying the cost. The soldiers from working class towns in Ohio and Georgia and Texas were paying the cost. The Iraqi and Afghan civilians were paying the cost. And the American taxpayer, watching their schools underfunded and their infrastructure crumbling and their health care unaffordable, was paying the cost. A war with Iran would be orders of magnitude more expensive, not just in direct military spending, though that would be staggering, but in the economic disruption that would follow. Oil prices would spike immediately upon any serious escalation. A closure or even a partial disruption of the Strait of Hormuz would send shockwaves through the global economy. Supply chains that are already fragile, and the pandemic showed us exactly how fragile they are, would be further disrupted. Inflation, which the American working class is already struggling with, would get worse. And who would bear that burden? Not the people making the decisions, not the defense industry executives, not the politicians whose campaigns are funded by the interests that profit from military spending. The working people of this country would bear it, as they always have. There is also a geopolitical dimension to this that cannot be ignored. We are not living in 2003 anymore. The world has changed in fundamental ways over the last 2 decades. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, China's GDP was roughly 1/6 of America's. Today, it is approaching parity and in some measures has surpassed it. Russia, whatever its military failures in Ukraine, is still a nuclear power and still a major energy supplier to Europe. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now an expanding coalition, are actively building alternative financial and trade structures that reduce dependence on the dollar and on American-dominated institutions. The petrodollar, which has been one of the pillars of American economic dominance since the 1970s, is showing real cracks. Saudi Arabia has conducted oil transactions in Chinese yuan. Multiple countries are exploring alternatives to the SWIFT banking system. This is the context in which a war with Iran would take place, and it is a radically different context than the one that existed when America felt it could act unilaterally without serious global consequence. A war with Iran would almost certainly push Iran further into the orbit of China and Russia. Iran is already part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China is Iran's largest trading partner. The two countries signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement that covers trade, energy, and defense. A military confrontation with the United States would accelerate and deepen those relationships. It would also send a message to every other country in the global South that American military aggression remains the defining feature of American foreign policy, regardless of which party holds the White House. That message has consequences. It accelerates the shift away from American-led institutions. It strengthens the arguments of those who say that the dollar-dominated financial system is a tool of coercion rather than a neutral structure. And it further erodes the soft power and moral authority that America still, however diminished, possesses. Let's talk honestly about the nuclear dimension, because this is the aspect of the Iran question that should give every serious person pause. Iran is not a nuclear-armed state, but it is a nuclear threshold state. The IAEA has reported that Iran has enriched uranium to levels that have no civilian justification. Iran has the technical capacity to produce a nuclear weapon, and the question of whether it will choose to do so is significantly affected by whether it believes military aggression from the United States or Israel is imminent. This is the fundamental strategic paradox at the heart of the Iran debate. The more aggressively the United States threatens Iran militarily, the more rational it becomes for Iran to pursue a nuclear deterrent as quickly as possible. North Korea drew this conclusion after watching what happened to Iraq and Libya, both countries that gave up or abandoned weapons of mass destruction programs and were subsequently attacked or destabilized by the United States. The lesson those governments drew was that having a nuclear deterrent is the only reliable protection against American regime change. Iran's leadership has drawn the same lesson, and every act of American or Israeli military aggression against Iran reinforces it. So the paradox is this: the military option that is supposed to prevent Iranian nuclearization may in fact accelerate it. And then we have to talk about what victory would even mean. This is the question that never gets asked seriously in Washington, because asking it would require confronting the fundamental incoherence of the entire enterprise. What is the goal? Is the goal to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities? That might be achievable through airstrikes, but military analysts estimate it would set the program back by a few years at most, not end it, and would guarantee that Iran would accelerate its nuclear program with maximum urgency and public support afterward. Is the goal regime change, the removal of the Islamic Republic, and the installation of a government more favorable to American interests? Iraq and Afghanistan answered that question. You can remove a government, you cannot install a society. Is the goal to permanently neutralize Iran as a regional power? Iran is a nation of 90 million people with one of the oldest continuous civilizations on earth. It has survived the Mongol invasions, the Ottoman Empire, British colonialism, and a brutal 8-year war with Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of its people. The Islamic Republic is not popular, but the Iranian nation is not going anywhere. There is no version of American military action against Iran that ends with Iran neutralized as a regional power. There is only a version that makes Iran more hostile, more radical, more determined, and more allied with American rivals. This brings us to the deeper question, which is about the nature of American power itself and the crisis that American capitalism is experiencing at this historical moment. Because the argument for military action against Iran is never really about Iran. It is about the maintenance of a particular global order, an order in which American military and economic dominance sets the rules, controls the resources, and punishes those who deviate. That order was established after World War II and consolidated after the Cold War, and it is now under serious structural challenge, not primarily from Iranian missiles or Russian provocations, but from the internal contradictions of the system itself. The American working class has seen its real wages stagnate for 50 years. Wealth inequality in the United States has returned to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The infrastructure of the country is crumbling. The healthcare system is the most expensive in the world and delivers worse outcomes than almost every other wealthy country. The education system is underfunded and increasingly inaccessible. And the political system has become so captured by corporate and financial interests that it cannot address any of these problems in any meaningful way. War, historically, has served a function in this context. It redirects popular anger. It creates a foreign enemy that substitutes for the domestic enemy that actually shapes people's lives. It justifies the allocation of public resources to military spending rather than social spending. It wraps the interests of the powerful in the language of national security and patriotism, making it politically dangerous to question them. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern that runs through American history, and it is a pattern that is playing out again as the drums beat louder on Iran. The people who will send other people's children to fight in Iran will not send their own. The people who will profit from the contracts and the oil disruption and the financial flows of war will not be the ones dying in the desert, and the people who will pay for it for decades through debt and austerity and underfunded public services are the same people who have been paying for every American war since Korea. What makes Iran different from Iraq and Afghanistan is not just scale, not just geography, not just the proxy network. What makes Iran different is that it represents a war that even the architects of American empire at some level know they cannot win on their own terms. The military establishment knows it. The intelligence community knows it. Many of the senior military officers who would be asked to plan and execute such a war have said so in various ways in their memoirs and their post-retirement interviews. The question is whether the political system has the capacity to hear that and act accordingly. And the evidence of the last 20 years is not encouraging, because the same voices that told us Iraq would be quick are now telling us Iran is manageable. The same think tanks that gave intellectual cover to the Afghan nation-building project are now producing papers on Iranian regime fragility. The same financial and defense interests that profited from 2 decades of Middle Eastern war are now eyeing the next chapter. And the same political class that never faced accountability for the lies and the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan is still in Washington, still on television, still shaping the conversation. The system that produced those disasters has not reformed itself. The incentives that drove those decisions have not changed. And so the analysis has to be honest. The danger of a war with Iran is not primarily that it will be started by reckless people who don't know what they're doing. The danger is that it will be started by people who know exactly what they're doing, who know that they will profit from it, who know that the costs will be borne by others, and who have spent decades in a political system that has never once made them answer for the consequences. The American people deserve to understand what they are being asked to support and what they will be asked to pay and who will be collecting the benefit. Iran is not a paper tiger. It is not a country that can be shocked and awed into submission and then rebuilt according to an American blueprint. It is a nation with deep historical roots, significant military capabilities specifically designed to make American military action costly and inconclusive, a regional network that can turn any conflict into a multi-front catastrophe, and a population that will not cooperate with its own occupation. The history of the last 20 years is a history of the gap between what American military power can destroy and what it cannot build. Iraq proved it, Afghanistan proved it. And the honest, uncomfortable, necessary conclusion that follows from that history is that a war with Iran would not be a new chapter. It would be the same chapter, written larger, costing more, lasting longer, and ending the same way, except this time the global context is different, the economic stakes are higher, the nuclear risks are real, and the margin for American strategic error is significantly narrower than it was when the tanks rolled into Baghdad in 2003.